Welcome. Today we have with us Jesuit Father Tom Greene, Secretary for Social and International Ministries of the Jesuit Conference, and Shaina Aber, Policy Director in the Social and International Ministries Office of the Jesuit Conference as well. And they both recently returned from Honduras, a trip to learn about the human rights situation there and also better understand the work of the Jesuits in response to that situation. So, in light of that trip, I was hoping that we could start out with you offering a little bit of insight into the general situation of human rights for Hondurans, especially the most vulnerable in the country. And I'm not sure who wants to address that question first, but I thought we could start there.
Go ahead, Shaina.
Okay. Well, first, Chris, thanks for having us. And this is such an important issue for the Jesuit network to really become more aware of. Obviously, we're all very familiar with the history of the Jesuits and their struggle for protecting human rights and human dignity of people in Central America during the 80s. And I think that there's a tendency to stop really looking at what's going on in Central America or what went on in Central America after the mid-90s, after the wars ended. Honduras actually is now has the highest murder rate in the world. It has a situation which I would call kind of layers of violence. So there's the generalized violence that I think really stems from a lack of institutionality, just the fragility of the institutions and a lack of respect in general for the rule of law that stems in part from the vast amounts of arms that entered the country after the wars in El Salvador and Nicaragua ended, but also from a 2009 democratic crisis or coup by the military in Honduras, which really, I think, had grave consequences for the respect for rule of law in the country at the society level. The coup really fractured institutions and caused a lot of conflict, even within civil society in Honduras, even within the human rights community. And so on top of that generalized violence, you also have a series of trends that kind of show targeted attacks against certain sectors of society that speak out for the rights of certain particular groups. Journalists in particular have been targeted since 2009. About 30 journalists have been killed, assassinated in attacks that look like they were carried out by either gangs or by police or by some unknown actors. Women have really suffered the brunt of this, of the generalized violence, and they seem to be a group that is in particularly vulnerable situation in Honduras. A woman is killed every 16 hours in Honduras. That's the rate of femicide, as they call it. We're not talking about baby girls here when we say femicide in Honduras. We're talking about girls and women. There's also a number of attacks that have been carried out against campesino groups that are struggling for their land rights. We have documentation of about 57 attacks on or deaths of campesinos who've been involved in a very intense land struggle in the Bajo Aguan region. There's also been attacks carried out on campesinos in other parts of the country that are struggling for land rights. And then you have also targeted attacks against lawyers and other human rights defenders that are engaged in the business of trying to protect others' rights. So this is a situation that is increasingly troubling. On top of that, I think you have what is best described as basically a captured state. The state has been captured by the interests of narco traffickers, of extremely wealthy but extremely corrupt landowners. And these narco traffickers and landowners are using the police and the military for their own ends, rather than using the police and the military to carry out the work of the state. The justice system has been completely inverted and corrupted, so that the justice system is being used by certain groups to further their own private agendas, including capturing land for mining, for African palm, for hydroelectric dams, and basically the police that are not crooked, that are not captured by these forces, seem to view their role as combating gangs by targeting youth, because youth are seen as kind of the base of the violence. So we are seeing also increasing trends of what can only be seen as social cleansing. In San Pedro Sula, in recent months, there have been several attacks against youth leaders or youth in communities. There was one really brutal attack where 6 young men were lined up against the wall by police and just shot, and there were blood spatters along the wall. The police called it, said there had been a gun battle, but it's very, very clear that this was an extrajudicial execution. While we were there, a video came out, a very disturbing video, which showed 2 young men walking to a market with backpacks on in the early hours of the morning. 2 SUVs pulled up, a bunch of men got out carrying really large rifles. The kids stopped and kind of held their hands up, then they were forced to the ground, and once on the ground, they were shot multiple times in their back. That was caught on a police surveillance camera and was leaked to the media after three months of the police just sitting on that video and not doing any follow-up or investigation. And so what people are really saying in the country is youth are being criminalized. It's a crime to be a young person in this country because the police, who are not captured by the narco forces, view youth as the problem. And so those are the kind of tensions that we see in the country and the real challenges that the country is facing. Tom, I don't know if you want to add anything.
No, that's pretty thorough. I mean, I guess, Shaina, what I would just say is what you picked up on there at the end with the video. Chris, I went down for 2 weeks, or about 10 days, and the beginning of it was the Social Apostolate meeting. So the Jesuits and lay leaders of the Social Apostolate, the social ministries in Central America, were gathered, and we had an opening prayer, and they said, okay, we're going to have a little video to open the prayer. And I thought, okay, well, what are you going to get? You know, some music, maybe some scenes of the countryside. Well, it was this video captured, and we can give you the link to that, but it was captured and put on the national newspaper website, and you're watching these young men get put on the ground and assassinated, and you really can't believe your eyes in one way. You know, you're saying this can't be taking place, and then you're thrown into the reality of, yes, this is taking place. So it was a curious way to start a prayer, but it's very powerful because it was saying this is the reality of Honduras today, and how are we going to engage that reality? How does our faith call us to engage that reality? So for me, that was, the whole trip was, in a sense, and I've talked to Shaina about this a lot, we shared our reflections, continually being thrown into this reality of, my gosh, it is as bad as, it's worse than we read about, or it is actually taking place. Displacement's taking place, the land grab is taking place, the gang violence taking place, the corruption is taking place, the false imprisonment is taking place. And it just was one experience after another of that really, it's hard to describe, but it certainly brought us back with this kind of urgency, sense of urgency of how do we move things forward for Honduras, you know, and how do we increase awareness. So really grateful that ISN is reaching out to try and look at how ISN can respond, because Central America has always been an important part, and of course was the El Salvador martyrs were the kind of the genesis of ISN.
And Shaina and Tom, following up on that, you know, I think for a lot of people, their point of reference in terms of human rights in Central America is their historical understanding or their personal connection to the histories of El Salvador and Nicaragua. Could you speak from your own perspective on your understanding of those periods of time for those countries historically in terms of significant struggle with human rights abuses, how you would compare what's happening in Honduras right now?
You know, I would say, I know you're not saying this, but I just want to be clear. I don't want to get into a Honduras versus El Salvador, and neither would any Jesuit or layperson down there. But one of the things that I would hear from some Jesuits down there was how Honduras had become the El Salvador now. In other words, what El Salvador was in the 80s, 70s, and 80s in terms of violence, a divided country, real great instability, had now really come to Honduras. I mean, some would say that the guns and weapons of El Salvador had been sold to Hondurans. You know, it had kind of been transferred over in a sense. So I think two things. I think that Honduras has become the locus for human rights abuse. I mean, I don't want to make any great claims that El Salvador and Guatemala have improved their situations, because certainly what we call the Northern Triangle still suffers a great deal. But I would say Honduras right now is the most critical spot in terms of the instability and kind of slipping towards a failed state, if it's not already a failed state. And the other piece, and then I'd like Shaina to fill in, but the other interesting analysis for us has been the similarities between Colombia and Honduras in terms of large zones of ingovernability. You know, large zones where there just is no infrastructure or civil structure to protect the people. And perhaps the difference being that at least in Colombia there was enough of an infrastructure, whether that was judiciary or the police or the military, to kind of invest in and put trust in and confidence in, although there was abuse and malfeasance. But in Honduras, that's a real lack right now, is what structures can the people depend on to protect their rights?
Yeah, I think it bears mentioning that while the wars were going on in El Salvador and Nicaragua, the U.S. was actually using Honduras as its base for training the Contras. So while, you know, Honduras didn't have outright civil war during the time, it was still a very violent place, and there were disappearances, and there was a very militaristic state. After 1994, a lot of work was done within Honduras to kind of support the judicial system, to have an independent judiciary, to make the police independent of the military. And unfortunately, we've seen so much backsliding in that just over the last few years. What we saw over and over again, and I speak more for myself than for Tom because he didn't have a chance to kind of do a loop around the country, which I had the opportunity to do. We would see police checkpoints that were being controlled by military. While I was in Tegucigalpa, the capital, the main police post on one side of the city was taken over by the military, and the state basically excuses this increased militarization and the creeping use of military in the civilian governance and civilian law enforcement capacity as a response to police corruption. Unfortunately, however, that really does make certain sectors of society very vulnerable, and what you're seeing is more and more that the military is controlling sectors of the country that are otherwise considered ungovernable. In terms of analogizing what happened in El Salvador and what happened in Nicaragua to what's happening now in Honduras, I would caution against using the same frame to describe U.S. policy in Honduras. I don't think that there's a conspiracy being orchestrated by the CIA or any body of the U.S. government to undermine the government of Honduras. In fact, I think quite the opposite. They would like Honduras to function as a stable society. But unfortunately, their way of going about that, I do not think is yielding results that any of us want. I see that we've partnered quite heavily with the military and the police to the detriment of really partnering with institutions that that need a lot of help, like civil society, like the public prosecutor, and like the justice sector in general. And because of the history of the U.S. in Central America during the 80s and the early 90s, there is a perception problem in terms of what the U.S. is doing. So a lot of segments of society don't trust the U.S. They don't trust the U.S. Embassy because of our really troubled history in the region. And so the U.S. Embassy, to a certain extent, is desperately looking for partners that they can trust will help to kind of cure this madness. And the vast majority of groups that are trustworthy and have good ideas don't want to get anywhere near the embassy.
Great, thanks for those comments. I think there are obviously so much has changed over the past 20 and 30 years in terms of the situation in Central America, situation in the United States, and so. But I appreciate your comments and the caution in terms of how we look at this and compare it to those periods for El Salvador and other countries in the region. Tom, earlier you mentioned that you began your time in Honduras with folks, Jesuits and lay partners working in the social apostolate in Honduras. Could you speak a little bit to the work that is going on there amongst the Jesuits and their lay partners in the country?
Yeah, I mean, one thing to know is that the Jesuit presence in Honduras is probably the most reduced of any of the Central American countries, well, with the exception maybe of Panama and Costa Rica, but you're not talking about El Salvador where there's a university, or Nicaragua or Guatemala where you have a university. But they do have a large impact because of the type of work they have. So the two major, I would say, works of the society there are Radio Progreso, which is a radio station, the largest in that section of the country, the largest community radio station, has about 1.5 million listeners in that area. And so it plays a very important role. How do they do that? Well, they do news and analysis, but perhaps more particularly to our Jesuit way of proceeding, that the Jesuit Ismael Moreno, who's the director, Melo, has a show in the morning every day called La Palabra, which is the word. And it's a way of taking the faith justice approach and how our faith, whatever scripture he takes that day, should inform what's going on in the country and how your faith calls you to be active in engaging the society. One of the things that you see is that this kind of euphoria for change, or the hope that the country would improve, has kind of gone by the wayside after the successive governments. And so now there's kind of a complacency among the people. And so a large part of what they try and do is formation and mobilization and getting people to think about how do we go about creating this just society that we want. So Radio Progreso is one, and then they work as one team with a social center called ERIC, which is Equipo de Reflexión, Investigación y Contemplación. So research, investigation, and contemplation. And they do a lot of work, some really wonderful work, research and analysis, human rights documentation, the great work with migrants, particularly men and women, young men and women, some of whom, I think they're women in this group, but amputees. So those who have been going north through Central America, through Mexico, and have either been assaulted or thrown from the train. And you don't think about a lot of the complications from that. Obviously, there's the physical complications from losing limbs, but there's also the psychological damage. And so they have a really wonderful pastoral work that sometimes will actually go to the shelters in Mexico and work with the Hondurans, the people from El Progreso in those areas, about the importance of coming home and not being ashamed to come back. They went to the U.S. to be a provider, and they're coming back needing to be provided for, but that's their sense. And so it's a beautiful program of kind of self-esteem and self-empowerment that it works with people and brings them back. So those are two works that I'd named. The Jesuits really are focused in parishes. They have one high school in Honduras, and they're trying to move a bit more of their presence into Tegucigalpa, which is the capital, both the radio station and some of the social analysis work they do. I think that's kind of a nice part of their apostolic plan for the future.
And Tom, are there, any partnerships with U.S. provinces or twinning relationships in Honduras?
You know, as you know, lots of people have connections with Honduras in terms of universities and high schools and whatnot. I'd say that the province to province, the most significant there is the twinning between the Missouri province and the Central American province, which has been a long-standing twinning that's really been wonderful, both in kind of the modern way that we talk about twinnings, or the contemporary way, and that it's not just a one-way financial giving. It's an exchange of ideas, it's cultural exchange, it's language exchange, it's Central American Jesuits spending time teaching in our high schools and vice versa. And so it's really a way of, and of course now the advocacy component. And by the way, Brian Christopher, who is a Missouri Jesuit who's in Belize, joined us in Honduras for the Social Apostolate meeting and for part of our time as a way of trying to connect not only the Missouri province but also Belize. And of course the issues of drug trafficking and migration and human rights violations that are also occurring in Belize. So joining Eric and Belize in that effort.
That's great. And you know, we've referenced it a couple times. We've talked about a little bit about the role of U.S. policy in Honduras and the Central American region today. I was wondering if you could offer, either of you could offer some insights or some perspectives on, you know, as people here in the U.S. try to be in relationships of solidarity with those in Honduras and wanting to support and advocate where appropriate, what might be some things to listen for, things to pay attention to as we look at U.S. policy in Honduras, and maybe some things to even think about acting on moving forward.
I'll let Shaina give you a much fuller and better answer, but I had three things, Chris. The first was kind of looking internally for the U.S. As individuals, and it's a very simple one, which is how does our drug consumption fuel everything that's going on in this narco state? You know, we have a serious drug problem in this country that's fueling a lot of violence and costing a lot of people's lives, and so I'd say that's one thing that we have to look at, both as policy but as individuals in the United States. Second is looking in terms of foreign aid, so what our actions affect Honduras. How does our foreign aid, even if it's well-intended, to military and police actually increase insecurity? It sounds counterintuitive, but you know, if you're giving money to those agencies that are charged with increasing security, and yet they're abusing people's rights, or they're being paid off, or the weapons are ending up in the wrong hands, then you're actually increasing insecurity. So looking at our foreign aid and those things that can really make a difference. And the final, I would say, would be immigration policy in the United States. So how does our domestic immigration policy here, the lack of family reunification, the lack of employment visas, the increased militarization of the border, trap people? So how does that contribute to the instability and separate the family and kind of the social consequences of our migration policy? So those would be the three things: our use of drugs, our foreign aid, and our immigration policy.
Just to put this in perspective a little bit, Honduras is $3 billion in debt currently. They have a GDP of $17 billion, and they're $3 billion in debt. And our aid to them has been basically military aid. We've actually encouraged them to buy weapons from us. Last year, or actually in 2011, we sold, through direct commercial sales, $1.3 billion worth of weapons to Honduras. There are things that we can think about. What are we doing selling $1.3 billion worth of weapons to a country that's $3 billion in debt and is cutting their free education system for poor kids, zeroing it out this year? You know, what message are we sending about what our values are? Unfortunately, I think the U.S. tends to look at Central America through the lens of keeping people from coming here, and number two, keeping drugs from coming here. And too often we leave out of the equation the fact that there are some really serious push factors that keep people coming here and also drive insecurity in the region. There's something called the Central America Regional Security Initiative, CARSI, through which we're funding the military and the police, and mainly funding them in terms of weapons and tactical training. Now, there are some human rights conditions that have been put on that funding in the past few years, but every year the Congress has tried to take them out, and fortunately we have some friends in the Senate who've been strong enough to keep those human rights conditions in. We heard from NGO after NGO how important it is to condition the aid to military and police in Honduras, and how that sends a message that the U.S. does care about who's acting in accordance with our human rights values. We will be coming up with, somebody's trying to call us, we will be coming up with some other solutions. Hold on just a second. I'm going to try to send this to voicemail. Okay. We will be coming up with some other human rights and development solutions, hopefully in the next few weeks, and we'd like you to stay tuned. We have a work plan that we're currently developing with Eric and Radio Progreso to place articles about the current situation in Honduras, and also to keep the Jesuit network informed. And if you have ideas of where we could place them, please do contact us. We also will be basically monitoring the appropriations process in Congress this year, and there will be a time when we'll be sending out an action alert. And so if you're not yet on our action alerts, please do sign up. You can go to Jesuit.org and click on social justice, and there will be a place where you can sign up for our action alerts. I think also there's been a trend, I think, in recent years since Honduras hit the highest murder rate in the world, for U.S. organizations that had been contributing to Honduras or had been going down to Honduras in immersion experiences, or to give, one-off humanitarian assistance to hospitals or to schools. There's been a tendency in recent years, since the security situation has gotten so grave, to pull back a little. And I would really encourage folks not to do that. Having our folks go down to Honduras, making those connections, staying involved and informed, it's really important. And one thing that was said to us on several occasions was how much they miss the engagement from the U.S. The Diocese of Dallas, the Diocese of Dallas. The Diocese of Dallas used to go down to the Bajo Aguan region every year and do a medical mission with doctors from the Dallas Diocese. They no longer do that because of the travel warning. I think a lot of our universities used to send immersion trips down there, and they don't do that because of the travel warning that's in effect. And that travel warning is there for a good reason. This is a dangerous place, and people's lives are being lost on a daily basis. In fact, 20 people die every day. But just kind of having this hands-off attitude and not engaging at all is having a really significant impact on both the health and the education sector in the country. And I think this is why we see some trends that are really troubling, where the government is choosing not to fund free education in the country anymore.
Well, that's great. And Shaina, you thought of the question I had, is in terms of thinking about organizations, whether U.S.-based or international organizations that would be good resources for information. Are there any other organizations you would want to suggest as good sources for information on the continuing human rights situation in Honduras?
Well, I was joined down there after Tom left by Lisa Halgard, who's the executive director of the Latin American Working Group, and they've been doing some great organizing around Honduras. She's a great resource in general on Central America. Lisa actually lived in Central America for in Nicaragua for 3 years, actually working with the Jesuits, and she's a really Log is a really dependable and wonderful resource in terms of how U.S. policy is affecting the region. So their website is www.lawg.org, and they pretty frequently blog on Honduras, and will have action alerts and the like around important Honduras issues. The Sisters of Mercy also have a good presence down there and have been doing advocacy around this.
Great, great. Well, is there anything else that you want to share about the situation in Honduras before we finish up?
Well, there's always a tendency to talk about, the things that overpowered us and depressed us, but also always want to point out lots of great people, lots of great men and women, both doing great work, putting their lives on the line in some ways to speak out for human rights, for freedom of the press, for lots of important causes that perhaps we take for granted. But I guess just that people recognize there are a lot of good people there who need our help.
Great. Well, thank you, Tom and Shaina. As you mentioned, and we've talked about in different ways, the challenges that the people of Central America face are something that is very close to the Jesuit and Ignatian family here in the U.S. And Shaina, your point about the number of immersion experience groups from Jesuit universities and high schools and parishes across the country, some who continue to go down despite the travel warning, but there is a genuine interest and concern, and so hopefully your insights from your visit recently and further information you can share can help us to continue to be in a relationship of solidarity with the people of Honduras moving forward. So I want to thank you very much and look forward to talking with you again soon.
Thanks a lot, Chris.
Thanks.